Let's go over live to the United States now and speak to former White House Security Advisor Stephen Yates. Good morning to you. We've heard about a very personal story there. Let's talk about the big picture and the two world leaders, Obama and Putin, on the phone, frank and direct. I mean, you've been very closely involved in things like this in the past. What kind of conversation will that have been?
Well, I'm afraid it's been a repeat of recent conversations. I mean, President Obama and President Putin have spoken several times. President Obama seems to be saying that he's warned President Putin not to encroach further on Ukrainian sovereignty. He seemed to think that message would work in Crimea, and it obviously didn't. So I'm afraid what we've had is a repeat. And they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. What we have here is doing very little to nothing and expecting happy results.
I mean, the dilemma, I suppose, for the West is that whether we think this is pro-Russian Ukrainians or Russians themselves doing what's happening in the east of the country, there does appear to be genuine local support for this. And that's the real dilemma, isn't it, for the government in Kiev? Because essentially action against the Russians would mean action potentially against their own people, which presumably they're not prepared to.
It is a very difficult dilemma, and I think that your previous guest sized it up exactly right. But when we have an absence of real leadership from the West, and when people inside the Ukraine have no reason to believe that the United States, the United Kingdom, NATO, and others are going to be with them, then they begin to have to make deals with the people they live with inside their geography. And so it's hard to know if some of these populations in the eastern part of Ukraine, if they had the right kind of support, would they be as permissive to this kind of Russian encroachment?
And this time yesterday, when we were just sort of 15 minutes away from this deadline that the Ukrainian government had given for pro-Russians to put down their arms, I mean, it did feel tense and it felt worrying. I mean, to you, are we still far away from any kind of full-scale war, essentially?
I think we're at the risk of any time a wire tripping and we have accidental escalation or deliberate escalation basically at the behest of the pro-Russian forces. Of course, President Putin wants us to suspend disbelief. He wants us not to remember what was happening in the Ukraine. He wants us not to pay attention to the troops that have already been amassed. But given that they've already taken sovereign territory, it's not paranoid for the Ukrainians to imagine they'd go further. Really, I think all the cards are basically in Putin's hands still until the West decides whether and how it intends to do anything to stand by the Ukrainians.
Stephen Yates, we really appreciate you joining us this morning and also to